Okay, good morning, everyone. We are reading chapter 2 and 3 of the Graveyard Book this morning. And when I am done with chapter 2, I will stop and talk with anyone who's in chat. Chapter 2. Bod was a quiet child with somber gray eyes and a mop of tousled mouse-colored hair. He was, for the most part, obedient. He learned how to talk, and once he had learned, he would pester the graveyard folk with questions. "Why ain't I allowed out of the graveyard?" he would ask, or "How do I do what he just did?" or "Who lives here?" The adults would do their best to answer his questions, but their answers were often vague or confusing or contradictory, and then Bod would walk down to the old chapel and talk with Silas. He would be there waiting at sunset, just before Silas awakened. His guardian could always be counted on to explain matters clearly, lucidly, and as simply as Bod needed in order to understand. "You aren't allowed out of the graveyard." It's aren't, by the way, not ain't these days. Because it's only in the graveyard that we can keep you safe. This is where you live. This is where those who love you can be found. Outside would not be safe for you. Not yet. You go outside. You go outside every night. I am infinitely older than you, lad, and I am safe wherever I am. I'm safe there too. I wish that were true, but as long as you stay here, you are safe. Or, how could you do that? Some skills can be attained by education, some by practice, and some by time. Those skills will come if you study. Soon enough you will master fading and sliding and dream walking, but some skills cannot be mastered by the living, and for those you must wait a little while longer. Still, I do not doubt that you will acquire even those in time. You were given the freedom of the graveyard, after all, Silas would tell him. So the graveyard is taking care of you. While you are here, you can see in the darkness. You can walk some of the ways that the living should not travel. The eyes of the living will slip from you. I, too, was given the freedom of the graveyard, although, in my case, it comes with nothing but the right of abode. "I want to be like you," said Bod, pushing out his lower lip. "No," said Silas firmly, "you do not." Or, "Who lies there?" "You know, Bod, in many cases it's written on the stone. Can you read yet? Do you know your alphabet?" My what?" Silas shook his head, but said nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Owens had never been much for reading when they were alive, so there were no alphabet books in the graveyard. The next night Silas appeared at the front of the Owens' cozy tomb, carrying 3 large books. 2 of them brightly colored alphabet books. A is for apple, and B is for ball, and a copy of The Cat in the Hat. He also had paper and a packet of wax crayons. Then he walked Bod around the graveyard, placing the boy's small fingers on the newest and clearest of headstones and plaques, and taught Bod how to find the letters of the alphabet when they appeared, beginning with the sharp steeple of the capital A. Silas gave Bod a quest, to find each of the 26 letters in the graveyard, and Bod finished it proudly with the discovery of the Ezekiel Umsley's stone built into the side of the wall of the old chapel. His guardian was pleased with him. Every day Bod would take his paper and crayons into the graveyard, and he would copy names and words and numbers as best he could, and each night before Silas would go off into the world, Bod would make Silas explain to him what he had written, and make him translate the snatches of Latin which had, for the most part, baffled the Owenses. On a sunny day, bumblebees explored the wildflowers that grew in the corner of the graveyard, dangling from the grouse and the bluebells, droning their deep, lazy buzz, while Bod laid in the spring sunlight, watching a bronze-colored beetle wandering across the stone of Geo, Reader, his wife, Dorcas, and their son, Sebastian. Fidelis ad mortem. Bod had copied down their inscription and now was only thinking about the beetle when somebody said, "Boy, what are you doing?" Bod looked up. There was someone on the other side of the grouse bush, watching him. "Nothing," said Bod. He stuck out his tongue. The face on the other side of the grouse bush crumpled into a gargoyle, tongue sticking out, eyes popping, and then returned to a girl. "That was good," Bod said, impressed. "I can make really good faces," said the girl. "Look at this one." She pushed up her nose with her finger, creased her mouth into a huge, satisfied smile, squinted her eyes, and puffed out her cheeks. "Do you know what that was?" "No," said Bod. "It was a pig, silly." "Oh," Bod thought. "You mean like P is for pig." "Of course like that. Hang on." She came around the gorse bush and stood next to Bod, who got to his feet. She was a little older than he was, a little taller, and was dressed in bright colors, yellow, pink, and orange. Bod, in his gray winding sheet, felt dowdy and drab. "How old are you?" said the girl. "What are you doing here? Do you live here? What's your name?" "I don't know," said Bod. "You don't know your name?" said the girl. "Of course you do. Everybody knows their own names, fibber." "I know my name," said Bod, "and I know what I'm doing here, but I don't know the other thing you said." "How old you are?" Bod nodded. "Well," said the girl, what was you went on your last birthday?" "I didn't," said Bod. I never was." "Everybody gets birthdays. You mean you never had cake or candles or stuff?" Bod shook his head. The girl looked sympathetic. "Poor thing. I'm 5. I bet you're 5 too." Bod nodded enthusiastically. He was not going to argue with his new friend. She made him happy. Her name was Scarlet Amber Perkins, she told him, and she lived in a flat with no garden. Her mother was sitting on a bench nearby the chapel at the bottom of the hill reading a magazine, and she had told Scarlet to be back in half an hour, and to get some exercise and not to get into trouble or to talk to strangers. "I'm a stranger," pointed out Bod. "You're not," she said, definitely. "You're a little boy." And then she said, "And you're my friend, so you can't be a stranger." Bod smiled rarely, but he smiled then, hugely and with delight. "I'm your friend," he said. "What's your name?" "Bod. It's short for nobody." She laughed then. "Funny sort of name," she said. "What are you doing now?" "ABCs," said Bod, "from the stones. I have to write them down." "Can I do it with you?" For a moment, Bod felt protective. The gravestones were his, weren't they? Then he realized how foolish he was being, and he thought that there were things that might be more fun done in the sunlight with a friend. He said, "Yes." They copied down the names from the tombstones, Scarlet helping Bod pronounce unfamiliar names and words, Bod telling Scarlet what the Latin meant, if he already knew, and it seemed much too soon when they heard a voice further down the hill shouting, "Scarlet!" The girl thrust the crayons and paper back at Bod. "I gotta go," she said. "I'll see you next time," said Bod, "won't I?" "Where do you live?" she asked. "Here," he said, and he stood and watched her as she ran down the hill. On the way home, Scarlet told her mother about the boy called Nobody, who lived in the graveyard, and had played with her, and that night Scarlet's mother mentioned it to Scarlet's father, who said that he believed that imaginary friends were a common phenomenon at that age and nothing at all to be concerned about, and that they were fortunate to have a nature reserve so near. After that initial meeting, Scarlet never saw Bod first. On the days when it was not raining, one of her parents would bring her to the graveyard. The parent would sit on the bench and read, while Scarlet would wander off the path, a splash of fluorescent green or orange or pink, and then explore. Then, always sooner rather than later, she would see a small grave face and gray eyes staring up at her from beneath a mop of mouse-colored hair. And then Bod and she would play hide and seek, sometimes, or climbing things, or being quiet and watching rabbits behind the old chapel. Bod would introduce Scarlet to some of his other friends, that she could not see them, but it did not seem to matter. She'd already been told firmly by her parents that Bod was imaginary, and that there was nothing at all wrong with that. Her mother had, for a few days, even insisted on laying an extra place at the dinner table for Bod, so it came as no surprise to her that Bod also had imaginary friends. He would pass on their comments to her. "Bartleby says that thou dost have a face like a squished plum," he would tell her. "So does he. And why does he talk so funny? Doesn't he mean squashed tomato?" "I don't think they had tomatoes where he comes from," said Bod, "and that's just how they talk." Scarlet was happy. She was a bright, lonely child whose mother worked for a distant university, teaching people she'd never met face to face, grading English papers sent to her over the computer, and sending messages of advice and encouragement back. Her father taught particle physics, but there were, Scarlet told Bod, too many people who wanted to teach particle physics and not enough people who wanted to learn it, so Scarlet's family had to keep moving to different university towns, and in each town her father would hope for a permanent teaching position that never came. "What's particle physics?" asked Bod. Scarlet shrugged. "Well," she said, "there's atoms, which is things that is too small to see. That's what we're all made of. And there's things that are smaller than atoms, and that's particle physics." Bod nodded and decided Scarlet's father was probably interested in imaginary things. Bod and Scarlet wandered the graveyard together every weekday afternoon, tracing names with their fingers, writing them down. Bod would tell Scarlet whatever he knew of the inhabitants of the grave or the mausoleum or the tomb, and she would tell him stories that she'd been read or learned, and sometimes she would tell him about the world outside, about cars and buses and television and aeroplanes. Bod had seen them flying high overhead and thought them loud silver birds, but never been curious about them until now. He, in his turn, would tell her about the days when people in the graves had been alive, how Sebastian Reeder had been to London town and seen the Queen, who had been a fat woman in a fur cap, who had glared at everyone and spoke no English. Sebastian Reeder could not remember which queen she had been, but he did not think that she had been queen for very long. "When was this?" Scarlet asked. "He died in 1583. It says on his tombstone, so before then?" "Who's the oldest person here in the graveyard?" asked Scarlet. Bod frowned. "Probably Caius Pompeius. He came here 100 years after the Romans first got here. He told me about it. He liked the roads." "So he's the oldest?" "I think so." "Can we make a little house out of one of those stone houses?" You can't. It's locked." "They all are." "Can you get in?" "Of course." "Well, why can't I?" "The graveyard," he explained. "I've got the freedom of the graveyard. It lets me go places." "I want to go in the stone houses and make little houses." "You can't." "You're just mean." "Not." "Meanie." "Not." Scarlet put her hands in her pocket of her anorak and walked down the hill without saying goodbye, convinced that Bod was holding out on her, and at the same time suspecting that she was being a little unfair, which made her angrier. That night over dinner, she asked her mother and father if there was anyone in the country before the Romans came. "Where did you hear about Romans?" asked her father. "Everybody knows," said Scarlet with a withering scorn. "Was there?" "There were Celts," said her mother. "They were here first. They go back before the Romans. They were the people that the Romans conquered." On the bench beside the old chapel, Bod was having a similar conversation. "The oldest?" said Silas. "Honestly, Bod, I don't know. The oldest in the graveyard that I've ever encountered is Caius Pompeius, but there were people here before the Romans came, lots of them, going back a long time. How are your letters coming along?" "Good, I think. When do I learn joined-up letters?" Silas paused. "I have no doubt," he said after a moment's reflection, "that there are among the many talented individuals interred here at least a smattering of teachers. I shall make inquiries." Bod was thrilled. He imagined a future in which he could read everything, in which all the stories could be opened and discovered. When Silas had left the graveyard to go about his own affairs, Bod walked to the willow tree beside the old chapel and called to Caius Pompeius. The old Roman came out of his grave with a yawn. "Ah, yes, the living boy. How are you, living boy?" Bod said, "I do very well, sir." "Good. I am pleased to hear it." The old Roman's hair was pale in the moonlight. He wore a toga in which he was buried, with beneath it a thick woolen vest and leggings, because it was cold. It was a cold country at the edge of the world, and the only place colder was Caledonia, to the north, where the men were more animal than human and covered in orange fur and were too savage to even be conquered by the Romans, so it would soon be walled off in their perpetual winter. "Are you the oldest?" asked Bod. "The oldest in the graveyard? I am." "So you were here first to be buried here?" A hesitation. "Almost the first," said Caius Pompeius. "Before the Celts, there were other people on this island. One of them was buried here." "Oh?" Bod thought for a moment. "Where's his grave?" Caius pointed up the hill. "He's at the top," said Bod. Caius shook his head. "Then what?" The old Roman reached down and ruffled Bod's hair. "In the hill," he said. "Inside it. I was first brought here by my friends, and followed in their turn by the local officials and the mimes who wore the wax faces of my wife, taken by the fever in Calmudonium, and my father killed at the border skirmish in Gaul. 300 years after my death, a farmer, seeking a new place to graze his sheep, discovered the boulder that covered the entrance and rolled it away, and went down, thinking there might be treasure. He came out a little later, his hair now as white as mine." "What did he see?" Caius said nothing, and then, "He would not speak of it, or ever return. They put the boulder back, and in time they forgot. And then, 200 years ago, when they were building the Frostbisher vault, they found it once more. The young man who found the place dreamed of riches, so he told no one, and he hid there, and he hid the doorway behind Ephraim Pettifer's casket, and went down one night unobserved, or so he thought." "Was his hair white when he came up?" "He did not come up." Oh, so who's buried down there?" Caius shook his head. "I do not know young Owens, but I felt him. Back when this place was empty, I could feel something waiting, even then, deep in the hill." "What was he waiting for?" "All I could feel," said Caius Pompeius, "was the waiting." Scarlet was carrying a large picture book, and she sat next to her mother on the green bench near the gates, and she read her book while her mother inspected an educational supplement. She enjoyed the spring sunshine, and she did her best to ignore the small boy who waved at her first from behind an ivy-colored monument. Then, when she had resolved to no longer look at the monument, the boy popped up, literally, like a jack-in-the-box, from behind a tombstone. The tombstone read, Joji G. Soji, D. 1921. I was a stranger, and you took me in. He gestured towards her frantically, and she ignored him. Eventually, she put her book down on the bench. Mummy, I'm going for a walk now. Stay on the path, dear. She walked on the path until she was round the corner so she could see him, Bod waving at her from further up the hill. She made a face at him. I found things out, said Scarlet. Me too, said Bod. There were people before the Romans, she said, way back. They lived here. I mean, when they died, they put them underground in these hills with treasure and stuff, and they were called barrows. Oh, right, said Bod. That explains it. Do you want to come and see one? Now? Scarlet looked doubtful. You don't really know where one is, do you? And, I can't follow you where you go all the time. She had seen him slip through walls like a shadow. In reply, he held up a large rusted iron key. This was in the chapel, he said. It should open most of the gates up there. They used the same key for all of them. It was less work. She scrambled up the hillside beside him. You're telling the truth? He nodded, a pleased smile dancing at the corner of his lips. Come on, he said. It was a perfect spring day, and the air was alive with birdsong and bee hum. The daffodils bustled in the breeze, and here and there on the side of the hill a few early tulips nodded. A blue powdering of forget-me-nots and fine fat yellow primrose punctuated the green slope as the two children walked up the hill toward the Frobisher's little mausoleum. It was old and simple in design, a small forgotten stone house with a metal gate for a door. Bod unlocked the gate with his key, and they went in. It's a hole, said Bod, or a door, behind one of the coffins. They found it behind a coffin on the bottom shelf, a simple crawl space. Down there, said Bod. We go down there. Scarlet found herself suddenly enjoying the adventure rather less. She said, We can't see down there. It's dark. I don't need light, said Bod. Not while I'm in the graveyard. I do, said Scarlet. It's dark. Bod thought about the reassuring things he could say, like, There's nothing bad down there, but the tales of hair turning white and people never returning meant that he could not have said them with clear conscience, so he said, I'll go down first, and you wait for me up here. Scarlet frowned. You shouldn't leave me, she said. I'll go down, said Bod, and I'll see who's there, and I'll come back, and I'll tell you about it. He turned to the opening, bent down, and clambered through on his hands and knees. He was in a space big enough to stand up in, and he could see the steps cut into the stone. I'm going down the steps now, he said. Do they go down a long way? I think so. If you held my hand and told me where I was walking, she said, then I could come with you, if you make sure that I'm okay. Of course, said Bod, and before he'd finished speaking, the girl was coming through the hole on her hands and knees. You can stand up, Bod told her. He took her hand. The steps are just here. If you put 1 foot forward, you can find it. There, now, I'll go first. Can you really see? She asked. It's dark, said Bod, but I can see. He began to lead Scarlet down the steps, deep into the hill, and to describe what he saw to her as they went. It's steps down, he said, made of stone. There's stone all around us. Someone's made a painting on the wall. What kind of painting? A big, hairy C is for cow, I think, with horns. Then something that's more like a pattern, like a big knot. It's sort of carved into the stone, not just painted, see? He took his fingers and placed them into the carved knot work. I can feel it, she said. Now the steps are getting bigger. We're coming into some kind of big room now, but the steps are still going. Don't move. Okay, now I'm between you and the room. Keep your left hand on the wall. They kept going down. One more step and we're on a rock floor, said Bod. It's a bit uneven. The room was small. There was a slab of stone on the ground and a low ledge in one corner and some small objects on it. There were bones on the ground, very old bones indeed. Although below, where the steps entered the room, Bod could see a crumpled corpse dressed in the remains of a long brown coat. The young man who had dreamed of riches, Bod decided. He must have slipped and fallen in the dark. The noise began all about them, a rustling slither like a snake twining through dry leaves. Scarlet's grip on Bod's hand was harder. What was that? Do you see anything? No. Scarlet made a noise that was a half gasp, half wail, and Bod saw something, and he knew without asking that she could see it too. There was a light at the end of the room, and in the light a man came walking through rock, and Bod heard Scarlet choking back a scream. The man looked well preserved, but still like something that had been dead for a long while. He was painted, Bod thought, or tattooed, Scarlet thought, with purple designs and patterns. Around his neck hung a necklace of long, sharp teeth. I am the master of this place, said the figure, in words so ancient and guttural that they were scarcely words at all. I guard this place from all who would harm it. His eyes were huge in his head. Bod realized it was because he had circles drawn around them in purple, making his face look like an owl's. Who are you? Asked Bod. He squeezed Scarlet's hand as he said it. The indigo man did not seem to have heard the question. He looked at them fiercely. Leave this place, he said in words Bod heard in his head, words that were also a guttural growl. Is he going to hurt us? Asked Scarlet. I don't think so, said Bod. Then to the indigo man, he said he had as he had been taught. I have the freedom of the graveyard. I may walk wherever I choose. There was no reaction to this by the indigo man, which puzzled Bod even more, because even the most irritable inhabitants of the graveyard had been calmed by this statement. Bod said, Scarlet, can you see him? Of course I can see him. He's a big, scary, tattooey man, and he wants to kill us. Bod, make him go away. Bod looked at the remains of the gentleman in the brown coat. There was a lamp beside him, broken on the rocky floor. He ran away, said Bod aloud. He ran because he was scared, and he slipped or he tripped on the stairs and he fell. Who did? The man on the floor. Scarlet sounded irritated now, as well as puzzled and scared. What man on the floor? It's too dark. The only man I can see is the tattooey man. And then, as if to make quite sure that they knew he was there, the indigo man threw back his head and let out a series of yodeling screams, full-throated ululation that made Scarlet grip Bod's hand so tightly that her fingernails pressed into his flesh. Bod was no longer scared, though. I'm sorry, I said they were imaginary, said Scarlet. I believe it now, they're real. The indigo man raised something over his head. It looked like a sharp stone blade. All who invade this place will die, he shouted in his guttural speech. Bod thought about the man whose hair had turned white after he discovered the chamber, and how he would return to the graveyard or speak, how he would never return to the graveyard or speak of what he had seen. No, said Bod. I think you're right. This is the one. Is what? Imaginary. Don't be stupid, said Scarlet. I can see it. Yes, said Bod, and you can't see dead people. He looked around the chamber. You can stop now. We know it's not real. I will feast on your liver, screamed the indigo man. No, you won't, said Scarlet with a huge smile. Bod's right. Then she said, I think maybe it's a scarecrow. What's a scarecrow? Asked Bod. It's a thing farmers put in their fields to scare crows. Why would they do that? Bod quite liked crows. He thought they were funny, and he always liked the way they helped keep things in the graveyard tidy. I don't know exactly. I'll ask Mummy, but I saw one from a train, and I asked what it was. Crows think it's a real person. It's just a made-up thing that looks like a person, but it's not. It's just to scare crows away. Bod looked around the chamber and said, "Whoever you are, it isn't working. It doesn't scare us. We know it's not real. Just stop." The indigo man stopped. It walked over to a rock slab and lay down on it, and then it was gone. For Scarlet, the chamber was once more swallowed by darkness, but in the darkness she could hear a whining sound again, getting louder and louder, as if someone was circling around the room. Something said, "We are the Sleer." The hairs on the back of Bod's neck began to prickle. The voice in his head was something very old and very dry, like the scraping of a dead twig against a window of the chapel, and it seemed to Bod that there were more than one voice there, and they were talking in unison. "Did you hear that?" asked Scarlet. "I didn't hear anything, just a slithery noise. It made me feel strange, all prickly in my tummy, like something is going to happen." "Nothing is going to happen," said Bod. Then, to the chamber, he said, "What are you?" "We are the Sleer. We guard and we protect." "What do you protect?" "The resting place of the Master. This is the holiest of all holy places, and it is guarded by the Sleer." "You can't touch us," said Bod. "All you can do is scare." The twining voices sounded petulant. "Fear is the weapon of the Sleer." Bod looked down at the ledge. "Are those the treasures of your master? An old brooch, a cup, a little stone knife? They don't look like much." "The Sleer guards the treasures, the brooch, the goblet, the knife. We guard them for our master. When he returns, it comes back. It always comes back." "How many of you are there?" But the Sleer said nothing. The inside of Bod's head felt as if it were filled with cobwebs, and he shook it, trying to clear it. He then squeezed Scarlet's hand. "We should go," he said. He led her past the dead man in the brown coat, and honestly, Bod thought, if he hadn't gotten scared and fallen, the man would have been disappointed in his hunt for treasure. The treasures of 10,000 years ago were not the treasures of today. Bod led Scarlet carefully up the hill, through the hill, into the jutting black masonry of the Frobisher mausoleum. Late spring sunlight shone through the breaks in the masonry and through the bare door, shocking in its brightness. And Scarlet blinked and covered her eyes at the suddenness of the glare. Birdsong sang in the bushes, and a bumblebee droned past. Everything was surprising in its normality. Bod pushed open the mausoleum door and then locked it again behind them. Scarlet's bright clothes were covered in grime and cobwebs, and her dark face and hands were pale with dust. Further down the hill, somebody, quite a few somebodies, was shouting loudly and shouting frantically. Someone called, "Scarlet! Scarlet Perkins!" And Scarlet said, "Yes, hello." And before she and Bod had a chance to discuss what they had seen or talk about the Indigo Man, there was a woman in a fluorescent yellow jacket with "Police" on the back, demanding to know if she was okay and where she'd been, and if someone had been trying to kidnap her, and the woman was talking on the radio and letting everyone know that the child had been found. Bod slipped along beside them, and as they walked down the hill, the door to the chapel was open, and inside both of Scarlet's parents were waiting, her mother in tears and her father worriedly talking to the people on the mobile phone, along with the other policewomen. No one saw Bod as he waited in the corner. The people kept asking Scarlet what had happened to her, and she answered, as honestly as she could. She told them a boy called Nobody, who took her into deep inside the hill, where a purple tattoo man appeared in the dark, but he was really a scarecrow. They gave her a chocolate bar, and they wiped her face, and asked if the tattooed man had ridden a motorbike, and Scarlett's mother and father, now that they were relieved and not afraid for her any longer, were angry with themselves and with her, and they told each other that it was the other's fault for letting the little girl play in the cemetery, even if it was a nature reserve. And the world was a very dangerous place these days, and if you didn't keep your eyes on your children every second, you could not imagine what awful things they would be plunged into, especially a child like Scarlett. Scarlett's mother began sobbing, which made Scarlett cry, and one of the policewomen got into an argument with Scarlett's father, who tried to tell her that he, as a taxpayer, paid her wages, and she told him she was a taxpayer too and probably paid his wages, while Bod was in the shadows in the corner of the chapel, unseen by anyone, not even Scarlett, and watched and listened until he could take no more. It was twilight in the graveyard by now, and Silas came and found Bod up near the amphitheater, looking over the town. He stood beside the boy, and he said nothing, which was his way. "It wasn't her fault," said Bod. "It was mine, and now she's in trouble." "Where did you take her?" asked Silas. "Into the middle of the hill to see the oldest grave. Only there isn't anybody there, just a snaky thing called a sleer who scares people." Fascinating. They walked down the hill together and watched as the old chapel was locked up once more, and the police and Scarlett and her parents went off into the night. "Mrs. Burroughs will teach you joined-up letters," said Silas. "Have you read The Cat in the Hat yet?" "Yes," said Bod, "ages ago. Could you bring me more books?" "I expect so," said Silas. "Do you think I'll ever see her again?" "The girl? I very much doubt it." But Silas was wrong. 3 weeks later, on a gray afternoon, Scarlett came to the graveyard, accompanied by both her parents. They insisted that she remain in sight at all times, although they trailed a little behind her. Scarlett's mother occasionally exclaimed about how morbid it was, and how fine and good it was that they were soon to be leaving it behind forever. When Scarlett's parents began to talk to each other, Bod said, "Hello." "Hi," said Scarlett very quietly. I didn't think I'd see you again. I told them I wouldn't go with them unless they brought me back here one last time." "Go where?" "Scotland. There's a university there for Dad to teach particle physics at." They walked on the path together, a small girl in a bright orange-colored anorak and a boy in a gray winding sheet. "Is Scotland a long way away?" "Yes," she said. "Oh. I'd hoped you'd be here to say goodbye." "I'm always here." "But you aren't dead, are you, Nobody Owens?" "Course not." "Well, you can't stay here all your life, can you? One day you'll grow up, and then you will have to go and live in the world outside." He shook his head. "It's not safe for me out there." "Who says?" "Silas, my family, everybody." She was silent. Her father called, "Scarlett, come on, love, time to go. You've had your last trip to the graveyard. Now let's go home." Scarlett said to Bod, "You're brave. You're the bravest person I know, and you're my friend, and I don't care if you are imaginary." Then she fled down the path, back the way they'd come, to her parents and to the world. Okay, we're going to take a pause before we start Chapter 3.
One of them has like 3,000 followers.
Oh my god.
One of them that we decided that we're gonna vibe check each other at Ch.2.
Thank you. Oh, it's perfect. Late. Okay, thank you. Have a good day at work. Not sure. On this side. Okay, and we're back. We just finished chapter 2. We're gonna do chapter 3, and yeah, so here we go. Chapter 3, The Hounds of God. One grave in every graveyard belongs to ghouls. Wander any graveyard long enough, and you will find it, water-stained and bulging, with cracked or broken stone, scraggly grass, or rank weeds about it, and a feeling, when you reach it, of abandonment. It may be colder than the other gravestones, too, with the name on the stone that is all too often impossible to read. If there is a statue on the grave, it will be headless, or so scabbed with fungus and lichens as to look like fungus itself. If one grave in the graveyard looks like a target for petty vandals, then it's a ghoul gate. If the grave makes you want to be somewhere else, that is a ghoul gate. There was one in Bod's graveyard. There was one in every graveyard. Silas was leaving. Bod had been upset by this when he had first learned about it. He was no longer upset. He was furious. "But why?" said Bod. "I told you. I need to obtain some information, and in order to do that, I have to travel. To travel, I must leave here. We've already been over this." "What's so important that you have to go away?" Bod's 6-year-old mind tried to imagine something that could make Silas want to leave him, and it failed. "It's not fair." His guardian was unperturbed. "It is neither fair nor unfair, Nobody Owens. It simply is." Bod was not impressed. "You're meant to look after me. You said." "As your guardian, I have a responsibility for you. Yes, fortunately, I'm not the only individual in the world that is willing to take on this responsibility." "Where are you going away?" "Out. Away. There are things I need to uncover that I cannot uncover here." Bod snorted and walked off, kicking at imaginary stones. On the northwestern side of the graveyard, things had become very overgrown and tangled, far beyond the ability of the groundskeeper or the friends of the graveyard to tame it, and he ambled over there and woke a family of Victorian children who had all died before their 10th birthdays, and they played at hide-and-go-seek in the moonlight in the ivy-twined jungle. Bod tried to pretend that Silas was not leaving, that nothing was going to change, but when the game was done and he ran back to the old chapel, he saw 2 things that changed his mind. The first thing he saw was a bag. It was, Bod knew the moment he laid eyes on it, Silas's bag. It was at least 150 years old, a thing of beauty, black leather and brass fittings, and a black handle, the kind every bag a Victorian doctor or undertaker might have carried, containing every implement that might have been needed. Bod had never seen Silas's bag before. He had not even known that Silas had a bag, but it was a sort of bag that could only have belonged to Silas. Bod tried to peek inside it, but it was closed with a very large brass padlock. It was too heavy for him to lift. That was the first thing. The second thing was sitting on the bench by the chapel. "Bod," said Silas, "this is Miss Lipskew." Miss Lipskew was not pretty. Her face was pinched, and her expression was disapproving. Her hair was gray, although her face seemed too young for the gray hair. Her front teeth were slightly crooked. She wore a bulky mackintosh and a man's tie around her neck. "How do you do, Mrs. Lipskew?" said Bod. Mrs. Lipskew said nothing. She sniffed. Then she looked at Silas and said, "So, this is the boy?" She got up from her seat and walked around Bod. Nostrils flared as if she was sniffing him. She then made a complete circuit and said, "You will report to me upon waking and before you go to sleep. I have rented a room in a house over there." She pointed to a roof just visible from where they stood. "However, I shall spend my time in this graveyard. I am here as a historian, researching the history of old graves. You understand, boy? Da?" "Bod," said Bod. "It's Bod, not boy." "Short for nobody," she said. "A foolish name. Also, Bod is a pet name, a nickname. I do not approve. I will call you boy, and you will call me Miss Lipskew." Bod looked up at Silas pleadingly, but there was no sympathy in Silas's face. He picked up his bag and said, "You will be in good hands with Mrs. Lipskew, Bod. I am sure that the 2 of you will get on." "We won't," said Bod. "She's horrible." "That," said Silas, "was a very rude thing to say. I think you should apologize, don't you?" Bod didn't, but Silas was looking at him, and Silas was carrying his black bag and about to leave, for no one knew how long. So he said, "I'm sorry, Miss Lipskew." At first she said nothing in reply. She merely sniffed, and then she said, "I have come a long way to look after you, boy. I hope you're worth it." Bod could not imagine hugging Silas, so he held out his hand, and Silas bent over, gently shook it, engulfing Bod's small, grubby hand with his huge, pale one. Then, lifting his black leather bag as if it were weightless, he walked down the path and out of the graveyard. Bod told his parents about it. "Silas is gone," he said. "He'll be back," said Mr. Owens cheerfully. "Don't worry your head about that, Bod. Like a bad penny, as they say." Mrs. Owens said, "Back when you were born, he promised us that if he had to leave, he would find someone else to bring you food and keep an eye on you, and he has. He's so reliable." Silas had brought Bod food, true, and left it in the crypt each night for him to eat, but this was, as far as Bod was concerned, the least of the things Silas did for him. He gave advice, cool, sensible, and unfailingly correct. He knew more about the graveyard folk. He knew more than the graveyard folk did, for his nightly excursions into the world outside meant he was able to describe a world that was current, not hundreds of years out of date. He was unflappable and dependable. He had been there every night of Bod's life, so the idea of the little chapel without its only inhabitant was one that Bod found difficult to conceive of. Most of all, he made Bod feel safe. Mrs. Lipskew also saw her job as more than bringing food to Bod. She did that too, though. "What is that?" asked Bod, horrified. "Good food," said Mrs. Lipskew. They were in the crypt, and she had put 2 plastic containers on the tabletop and opened the lids. She pointed at the first. "Is beetroot barley stew soup?" She pointed at the second. "Is salad. Now you eat both. I make for you." Bod stared up at her to see if it was a joke. Food from Silas mostly came in packets, purchased from the kind of place that sold food late at night, and asked no questions. No one had ever brought food to him in a plastic container with a lid before. "It smells horrible," he said. "If you do not eat the stew soup soon, it will be more horrible. It will be cold. Now eat it," she said. Bod was hungry. He took the plastic spoon, dipped it in the purple-red stew, and he ate. The food was slimy and unfamiliar, but he kept it down. "Now the salad," said Mrs. Lipskew. She unpopped the top of the second container. It contained large lumps of raw onion, beetroot, and tomato, with all in a thick vinegary dressing. Bod put a lump of beetroot into his mouth and started to chew. He could feel the saliva gathering and realized that if he swallowed, he would throw it back up. He said, "I can't eat this. It's good for you. I'll be sick." They stared at each other, the small boy with tousled mousy hair and the pinched pale woman with not a sliver of hair out of place. Mrs. Lipskew said, "You eat one more piece." "I can't." "You eat one more piece now, or you will stay here until you have eaten it all." Bod picked up a piece of vinegary tomato, chewed it, choked it down. Miss Lipskew put the tops back on the containers and replaced them in the plastic shopping bag. She said, "Now, lessons." It was high summer. It would not get fully dark until almost midnight. There were no lessons in high summer. The time that Bod spent awake, he spent in an endless warm twilight in which he could play, explore, or climb. "Lessons?" he said. "Your guardian felt it would be good for me to teach you things." "I have teachers. Letitia Burrows teaches me writing and words, and Mr. Pennyworth teaches me his complete education system for younger gentlemen with additional material for those post-mortem. I do geography and everything. I don't need more lessons." You know everything then, boy? 6 years old and you already know everything? I didn't say that. Mrs. Lipskew folded her arms. Tell me about ghouls, she said. Bod tried to remember what Silas had told him about ghouls over the years. Keep away from them, he said. Is that all you know, da? Why do you keep away from them? Where do they come from? Where do they go? Why do you not stand near a ghoul gate, eh, boy? Bod shrugged and shook his head. Name the different kinds of people, said Mrs. Lipskew. Now. Bod thought for a moment. The living, he said. The dead, he said. Then cats, he offered uncertainly. You're ignorant, boy, said Mrs. Lipskew. That is bad. And you are content to be ignorant, which is worse. Repeat after me. There are the living, the dead, there are the day folk and the night folk, there are ghouls and mist-walkers, and there are high hunters and the hounds of God. Also, there are solitary types. What are you? Asked Bod. I am Miss Lipskew, she said sternly. And what's Silas? She hesitated, and then she said, He's a solitary type. Bod endured the lesson. When Silas taught him things, it was interesting. Much of the time, Bod didn't realize that he had been taught anything at all. Mrs. Lipskew taught in lists, and Bod could not see the point to it. He sat in the crypt, aching to be out in the summer's twilight, under the ghost moon. When the lesson was done, in the foulest of moods, he fled. He looked for playmates, but found no one, and he saw nothing but a large gray dog which prowled the gravestones, always keeping its distance from him, slipping between gravestones and through shadows. The week got worse. Mrs. Lipskew continued to bring Bod things she had cooked for him. Dumplings swimming in lard, thick radish purple soup with a lump of sour cream on it, small cold boiled potatoes, cold garlic-heavy sausages, hard-boiled eggs in gray, unappetizing liquid. He ate as little as he could to get away with it. The lessons continued. For 2 days she taught him nothing but the ways to call for help in every language in the world, and she would rap his knuckles with her pen if he slipped up or forgot. By the 3rd day, she was firing them at him. French? Au secours. Morse code? SOS. 3 short dots, 3 long ones, then 3 short ones again. Night gaunt? This is stupid. I don't remember what night gaunt is. They have hairless wings, and they fly low and fast. They don't visit this world, but they fly in the red skies above the road to Gulheim. I'm never going to need to know this. Her mouth pinched in tighter. All she said was, Night gaunt. Bod made the noise in the back of his throat that she had taught him, a guttural cry, like an eagle's cry. She sniffed. Adequate, she said. Bod could not wait until the day that Silas returned. He said, There's a big gray dog in the graveyard sometimes. It came with you. It came when you did. Is it your dog? Miss Lipskew straightened her tie. No, she said. Are we done? For today. You will read the list I gave you tonight and remember it for tomorrow. Mrs. Lipskew's lists were printed in pale purple ink on white paper, and they smelled odd. Bod took the new list up into the side of the hill and tried to read the words, but his attention kept sliding off it. Eventually, he folded it up and placed it beneath the stone. No one would play with him that night. No one wanted to play or to talk or to run or to climb beneath the huge summer moon. He went down to the Owens' tomb to complain to his parents, but Mrs. Owens would not hear a word said against Miss Lipskew on, as far as Bod was concerned, the unfair grounds that Silas had chosen her, while Mr. Owens simply shrugged and started telling Bod about the days when, as a young apprentice cabinet maker, and how he would have loved to have learned about all the useful things that Bod was learning, which was, as far as Bod was concerned, even worse. "Aren't you meant to be studying anyway?" Mrs. Owens asked. And Bod squeezed his fists together and said nothing. He stomped off into the graveyard, feeling unloved and unappreciated. Bod brooded on the injustice of it all and wandered through the graveyard, kicking at the stones. He spotted the dark gray dog and called to it to see if it would come over and play with him, but it kept its distance. And Bod, frustrated, threw a clump of mud towards it, which broke on the nearby gravestone and scattered everywhere. The big dog gazed at Bod reproachfully and then stepped away into the shadows and was gone. The boy walked down to the southeast side of the hill, avoiding the old chapel. He did not want to see the place that Silas wasn't. Bod stopped beside the grave and looked the way he felt. It was beneath an oak tree that had once been struck by lightning and was now just a black trunk, like a sharp talon coming out of the hill. The grave itself was water-stained and cracked, and above it was a memorial stone on which a headless angel hung, its robes looking like a huge, ugly tree fungus. Bod sat down on a clump of grass and felt sorry for himself, and had hated everybody. He even hated Silas for going away and leaving him. Then he closed his eyes and curled into a ball on the grass and drifted into a dreamless sleep. Down the street and up the hill came the Duke of Westminster, the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells, slipping and bounding from shadow to shadow, lean and all leathery, all sinews and cartilage, wearing all raggedy, tattered clothes. And they bound and loped and skulked, leapfrogging over the dustbins and keeping the dark sides of the hedges. They were small, like full-sized people who had shrunk in the sun. They spoke to each other in undertones and saying things like, "If your grace has any more blooming ideas of where we is than us do, I'd be grateful if he said so. Otherwise, he should be keeping his big awful hole shut. And all I'm saying, your worship, is that I knows there's a graveyard near here. I can smell it. And if you could smell it, then I should be able to smell it, 'cause I've got a better nose than you have, your grace." All this as they dodged and wove their way through suburban gardens. They avoided one garden. "Psst!" hissed the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Dogs!" And they ran atop the garden wall, scampering over it like rats the size of children. Down into the high street and up the road to the top of the hill. And then they were at a graveyard wall, and they went up it like squirrels up a tree, and they sniffed the air. "Where, dog?" said the Duke of Westminster. "Where? I don't know. Somewhere around here. Doesn't smell like a proper dog anyway," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Somebody couldn't smell this graveyard neither," said the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Remember, it's just a dog." The three of them leapt down from the wall to the ground, and they ran, using their arms much as their legs, to propel themselves forward through the graveyard to the ghoul gate by the lightning tree. And beside the gate, in the moonlight, they paused. "What's this when it's at home, then?" asked the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Lume," said the Duke of Westminster. Bod woke then. The three faces staring into his could have been those of mummified humans, fleshless and dried, but their features were mobile and interested. The mouths that grinned to reveal sharp, stained teeth, bright, beady eyes, clawed fingers that moved and tapped. "Who are you?" Bod said. "We," said one of the creatures. They were, Bod realized, only a little bigger than he was. "Is most important folk, we is. This here is the Duke of Westminster." The biggest of the creatures gave a bow, saying, "Charmed, I'm sure." "And this is the Bishop of Bath and Wells." The creature, which grinned sharp teeth and let a pointed tongue of improbable length waggle between them, did not look like Bod's idea of a bishop. Its skin was piebald, and it had a large spot across one eye, making it look almost piractical. And I've the honor of being the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh, at your service. The three creatures bowed as one. The Bishop of Bath and Wells said, "Now, me lad, what's your story, eh? And don't tell any porksies. Remember how you're talking to a bishop." "You tell him, your worship," said the other two. So Bob told them. He told them how no one liked him or wanted to play with him, how no one appreciated him or cared, or how even his guardian had abandoned him. "Blow me down," said the Duke of Westminster, scratching his nose, a little dried-up thing that was mostly nostrils. "What you need is to go somewhere that people would appreciate you." "There isn't anywhere," said Bod. "I'm not allowed out of the graveyard." "You needs an old world of friends and playfellows," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells, wiggling his long tongue. "A city of delights, of fun and magic, where you would be appreciated, not ignored." Bod said, "The lady who's looking after me, she makes horrible food. Hard-boiled egg soup and things. Ugh." "Food?" said the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Where we're going, the food's the best in the world. Makes me tum rumble and me mouth water just thinking about it." "Can I come with you?" asked Bod. "Come with us?" said the Duke of Westminster. He sounded shocked. "Don't be like that, your grace," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "'Ave a blinkin' heart. Look at the mite. 'Asn't a decent meal in him. Don't know how long." "I vote to take him," said the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. "There's good grub back at our place." He patted his stomach to show how good the food was. "So, you game for an adventure?" asked the Duke of Westminster, won over by a novel idea. "Or do you want to waste the rest of your life here?" And with bony fingers indicated the graveyard and the night. Bod thought of Miss Lipskew and her awful food and her lists and her pinched mouth. "I'm game," he said. His three new friends might have been his size, but they were far stronger than any child, and Bod found himself picked up by the Bishop of Bath and Wells and held high above the creature's head, while the Duke of Westminster grabbed a handful of his mangy-looking grass and shouted what sounded like "Skach, Stich, Kavach," and pulled. The stone slab that covered the grave swung open like a trapdoor, revealing darkness beneath. "Quick now," said the Duke, and the Bishop of Bath and Wells tossed Bod into the dark opening, then leapt after him, followed up by the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh, and then, with one agile bound, by the Duke of Westminster, who, as soon as he was inside, called out, "Wake, Carados!" to close the ghoul gate, and then the stone crashed down above them. Bod fell, tumbling through the darkness like a lump of marble, too startled to be scared, wondering how deep the hole beneath the grave could possibly be, when two strong hands caught him beneath the armpits, and he found himself swinging forward through the pitch blackness. Bod had not experienced total darkness for many years. In the graveyard he saw as the Dead Sea, and no tomb or grave or crypt was truly dark to him. He was now in utter darkness. Feeling himself being pitched forward in a sequence of jerks and rushes, the wind rushing past him. It was frightening, but also it was exhilarating. And then there was light, and everything changed. The sky was red, but not the warm red of a sunset. It was an angry, glowing red, the color of an infected wound. The sun was small and seemed like it was old and distant. The air was cold, and they were descending a wall. Tombstones and statues jutted out the side of the wall, as if a huge graveyard had been upended. And like three wizened chimpanzees in tattered black suits that that did up in the back, the Duke of Westminster, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, and the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh were swinging him from statue to stone, dangling Bod between them as they went, tossing him from one another, never missing him, always catching him with ease without even looking. Bod tried to look up to see the grave through which they had entered this strange world, but he had seen nothing but headstones. He wondered if each of the graves they were swinging past was a door for the kind of people who were carrying him. "Where are we going?" he asked, but his voice was whipped away by the wind. They went faster and faster. Up ahead of them, Bod saw a statue swing up, and another creature came catapulting out into this crimson-skied world, just like the ones that carried Bod. One wore a raggedy silken gown that looked like it had once been white. The other wore a stained gray suit, too large for it, the sleeves of which were shredded into shadowy tatters. They spotted Bod and his 3 friends, and made for them, dropping 20 feet with ease. The Duke of Westminster gave a guttural squawk and pretended to be scared, and Bod and the 3 of them swung down the wall of graves with the 2 new creatures in pursuit. None of them seemed to get tired or out of breath under the red sky, with the burnt-out sun gazing down upon them like a dead eye, but eventually they fetched up on one side of a huge statue of a creature whose face seemed to have become a fungoid growth. Bod found himself being introduced to the 33rd President of the United States and the Emperor of China. "This is Master Bod," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "He's going to become one of us." "He's in search of a good meal," said Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Well, you're guaranteed fine dining when you becomes one of us, young lad," said the Emperor of China. "Yep," said the 33rd President of the United States. Bod said, "I become one of you? You mean I turn into you?" "Smart as a whip, sharp as a tack. You'd have to get up pretty late in the night to put something past this lad," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Indeed, one of us, as strong, as fast, as unconquerable. Teeth so strong they can crush any bones, a tongue sharp and long enough to lick the marrow from the deepest marrow bone, or flay the flesh from a fat man's face," said the Emperor of China. "Able to slip from shadow to shadow, never seen, never suspected, free as the air, fast as a thought, cold as frost, hard as nails, dangerous as us," said the Duke of Westminster. Bod looked around at the creatures. "But what if I don't want to become one of you?" he said. "Don't want? Of course he wants. What could be finer? I don't think there's a soul in the universe who doesn't want to be just like us. We've got the best city. Ghoulheim," said the 33rd President of the United States. "The best life, the best food." "Can you imagine," interrupted the Bishop of Bath and Wells, "how fine a drink the black ichor that collects in a leaden coffin can be, or how it feels to be more important than kings and queens, than presidents or prime ministers or heroes? To be sure of it, in the same way that people are more important than Brussels sprouts." Bod said, "Who are you people?" "Ghouls," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Bless me, somebody wasn't paying attention, was he? We're ghouls." "Look!" Below them, a whole troop of little creatures were bouncing and running and leaping and heading for the path below them, and before he could say another word, he was snatched up by a pair of bony hands and was flying through the air in a series of jumps and lurches as the creatures headed down to meet the others of their kind. The wall of graves was ending, and now there was a road, and nothing but a road, a much-trodden path along a barren plain, a desert of rocks and bones that wound toward a city high on a huge hill that was many miles away. Bod looked up at the city and was horrified. An emotion engulfed him that mingled repulsion and fear and disgust and loathing, all tinged with shock. Ghouls did not build. They were parasites and scavengers, eaters of carrion. They called the city Gulheim, is something they found long ago but did not make. No one knows, if any human ever knew, what kind of creatures it was that made those buildings, who honeycombed the rock with tunnels and towers, but it is certain that no one but a ghoul folk could have wanted to stay there or even approach the place. Even from a path below, Gulheim, even miles from away, Bod could see that all of the angles were wrong. The walls sloped crazily, that it was every nightmare he had ever endured made into a place. Like a huge mouth with jutting teeth, it was a city that had been built just to be abandoned, in which all fears and madness and revulsions of the creatures who built it were made into stone. The ghoul folk had found it and delighted in it and called it home. Ghouls move fast. They swarmed along the path through the desert more swiftly than a vulture flies, and Bod was carried along by them, held high overhead by a pair of strong ghoul arms, tossed from one to another, feeling sick, feeling dread and dismay, and feeling stupid. Above them, in the sour red skies, things were circling on huge black wings. "Careful," said the Duke of Westminster. "Tuck him away. Don't want the night gaunt stealing him, bloody stealers." "Yar, we hate stealers," shouted the Emperor of China. Night gaunts in red skies above Gulheim. Bod took a breath and shouted just as Miss Lipskew taught him. He made a call like an eagle's cry in the back of his throat. One of the winged beasts dropped towards him, circled low. Bod made the call again until it was stifled by hard hands clamping over his mouth. "Good idea calling 'em down," said the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. "But trust me, they aren't edible until they've been rotting for at least a couple of weeks. They just cause trouble. No love lost between our sides and theirs, eh?" The night gaunt rose again in the dry desert air to rejoin his fellows, and Bod felt all hope vanish. The ghouls sped towards the city on the rocks, and Bod, now flung unceremoniously over the stinking shoulders of the Duke of Westminster, was carried with them. The dead sun set, and 2 moons rose, one huge and pitted and white, which seemed as it rose to be taking up half the horizon, although it shrank as it ascended. A smaller moon, a bluish-green color, of veins of mold and cheese, and the arrival of this moon was an occasion of celebration for the ghoul folk. They stopped marching and made a camp beside the road. One of the new members of the band, Bod thought it might have been the one introduced to him as the famous writer Victor Hugo, produced a sack which turned out to be filled with firewood, several pieces, still with the hinges or brass handles attached, along with a metal cigarette lighter, and soon made a fire, around which all the ghoul folk sat and rested. They stared up at the greenish-blue moon, and scuffled for the best places by the fire, insulting each other, sometimes clawing or biting. "We'll sleep soon, then set off for Gulheim at moonset," said the Duke of Westminster. "It's just another 9 or 10 hours' run along the way. We should reach it by the next moonrise. Then we'll have a party, eh? Celebrate you being made into one of us." "It doesn't hurt," said the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Not so as you'd notice. And think how happy you'll be." They all started telling stories then of how fine a wonderful thing it was to be a ghoul, of all the things they had crunched up and swallowed down with their powerful teeth. Impervious they were to disease or illness, said one of them. Why, it didn't matter what their dinner had died of, they could just chomp it down. They told of places they had been which mostly seemed to be catacombs and plague pits. "Plague pits is good eatin'," said the Emperor of China, and everyone agreed. They told Bod how they had got their names, how he, in turn, his, once he had become a nameless ghoul, would be named as they had been. But I don't want to become one of you, said Bod. One way or another, said the Bishop of Bath and Wells cheerily. You'll become one of us. The other way is messier, involves being digested, and then you're not really around very long to enjoy it. But that's not a good thing to talk about, said the Emperor of China. Best be a ghoul. We're afraid of nothing. All of the ghouls around the coffin-wood fire howled at this statement and growled and sang and exclaimed at how wise they were and how mighty and how fine it was to be scared of nothing. There was a noise then from the desert, far away, a distant howl, and the ghouls gibbered and they huddled closer to the flames. What was that? The ghouls shook their head. Just something out in the desert, whispered one of them. Quiet, it'll hear us. And all the ghouls were quiet for a bit until they forgot about the thing in the desert and began to sing a ghoul song filled with foul words and worse sentiments, the most popular of which were simply lists of which rotting body parts were the best to be eaten and in what order. I want to go home, said Bod, when the last bits of the song had been consumed. I don't want to be here. Don't take on so, said the Duke of Westminster. Why, you little coot, I promise you, as soon as you're one of us, you'll not even remember you even had a home. I don't remember anything about the days before I was a ghoul, said the famous writer Victor Hugo. Nor I, said the Emperor of China proudly. Nope, said the 33rd President of the United States. You'll be one of the select band of the cleverest, strongest, and bravest creatures ever, bragged the Bishop of Bath and Wales. Bod was unimpressed by the ghouls' bravery or their wisdom. They were strong, though, and inhumanly fast, and he was in the center of the troop of them. Making a break for it would have been impossible. They would be able to catch up with him before he could even cover a dozen yards. Far off in the night, something howled once more, and the ghouls moved closer to the fire. Bod could hear them sniffing and cursing. He closed his eyes, miserable and homesick. He did not want to become one of the ghouls. He wondered how he would ever be able to sleep when he was this worried and hopeless, and then, almost to his surprise, for 2 or 3 hours he slept. A noise woke him, upset, loud, and close. It was someone saying, Well, where is they, eh? He opened his eyes to see the Bishop of Bath and Wells shouting at the Emperor of China. It seemed that a couple of the members of the group had disappeared in the night, just vanished, and no one had an explanation. The rest of the ghouls were on edge. They packed up their camp quickly, and the 33rd President of the United States picked up Bod and bundled him over his shoulder. The ghouls scrabbled back down the rocky cliff road beneath a sky of the color of bad blood, and they headed towards Ghoulheim. They seemed significantly less exuberant this morning. Now they seemed, at least to Bod, as he was bounced along, to be running away from something. Around midday, with the dead-eyed sun high overhead, the ghouls stopped and huddled. Ahead of them, high in the sky, circling in the hot air currents, were the night gaunts, dozens of them riding the thermals. The ghouls divided into 2 factions. There were those who felt that the vanishing of their friends was meaningless, and those who believed that something, probably the night gaunts, was out there to get them. They came to no agreement, except for the general agreement to arm themselves with rocks to throw at the night gaunts should they descend, and they filled their pockets and their suits and their robes with pebbles from the desert floor. Something howled off in the distance to their left, and the ghouls eyed each other. It was louder than the night before, and closer, a deep, wolfish howl. "Did you hear that?" asked the mayor of London. "Nope," said the 33rd President of the United States. Me neither, said the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. The howl came again. We got to get home, said the Duke of Westminster, hefting a large stone. The nightmare city of Ghoulheim sat high atop a rocky outcrop ahead of them, and the creatures loped down the road towards it. Nightgaunt's coming, shouted the Bishop of Bath and Wells. Throw stones at the bleeders. Bod's view of things was upside down at this point, bouncing up and down on the back of the 33rd President of the United States. Gritty sand from the path blown up in his face, but he heard cries like eagles' cries, and once again Bod called for help in Nightgaunt. No one tried to stop him this time, but he was not sure that anyone could have heard him over the cries of the Nightgaunts or the oaths and the curses of the ghoul folk as they pitched and flung their stones into the air. Bod heard the howling again, and now it came from the right. There are dozens of them blooming blinkers, said the Duke of Westminster gloomily. The 33rd President of the United States handed Bod over to the famous writer Victor Hugo, who threw the boy into a sack and put it over his shoulder. Bod was just glad that the sack smelled of nothing worse than dusty wood. They're retreating, shouted a ghoul. Look at 'em go! Don't worry, boy, said a voice that sounded to Bod like the Bishop of Bath and Wells near the sack. There won't be any of this nonsense when we get you to Ghoulheim. It's impenetrable, is Ghoulheim. Bod could not tell if any of the ghouls had been killed or injured in fighting the Nightgaunts. He suspected, from the imprecations of the Bishop of Bath and Wells, that several more of the ghouls might have run off. Quickly, shouted someone who was probably the Duke of Westminster, and the ghouls set off at a run. Bod in the sack was uncomfortable, being painfully slammed against the famous writer Victor Hugo's back and occasionally banged on the ground. To make his time in the sack even more uncomfortable, there were several lumps of wood, not to mention sharp screws and nails in there with him, the final remnants of the coffin-based firewood. A screw just under his hand, digging into him. Despite being jogged and jostled and jostled and jarred with every one of his captor's steps, Bod managed to grasp the screw in his right hand. He felt the tip of it, sharp to the touch. He hoped, deep inside. Then he pushed the screw into the fabric of the sack beside him, working the sharp end and pulling it back, making another hole a little way below the first. From behind, he could hear something howl once more. It occurred to him that anything that could terrify the ghoul folk must itself be even more terrifying than he could imagine, and for a moment he stopped stabbing with the screw. What if he fell from the sack into the jaws of some evil beast? But at least if he died, thought Bod, he would have died as himself, with all his memories, knowing who his parents were, who Silas was, even who Mrs. Lipskew was. That was good. He attacked the sacking with his brass screw again, jabbing and pushing until he made another hole in the fabric. Come on, lads, shouted the Bishop of Bath and Wells. Up the steps, and then we're home, all safe in Ghoulheim. Hurrah, your worship, called someone, probably the Honorable Archibald Fitzhugh. Now, the motion of his captors had changed. It was no longer a forward motion. Now it was more a sequence of movements, up and along, up and along. Bod pushed at the sacking with his hand to try to make an eye hole. He looked out. Above the drear red sky below, he could see the desert floor, but it was now hundreds of feet below him. There were steps stretching out behind them, but the steps were made for giants, and the ochre rock to his wall and the ochre rock wall to his right. Ghoulheim, which Bod could not see from where he was, had to be above them. To his left was a sheer drop. He was going to have to fall straight down, he decided, onto the steps, and he would just hope that the ghouls wouldn't notice he was making a break for it in their desperation to be home and safe. He saw the Nightgaunts high in the red sky, hanging back, circling. He was pleased to see that there were no other ghouls behind him, The famous writer Victor Hugo was bringing up the rear, and no one was behind him to alert the ghouls to the hole that was growing in the sack, or see Bod if he fell out. But there was something else. Bod was bounced onto his side away from the hole, but he had seen something huge and gray on the steps pursuing them. He could hear an angry growling noise. Mr. Owens had an expression for two things he found equally unpleasant. "I'm between the devil and the deep blue sea," he would say. Bod had wondered what it meant, having seen in his life the graveyard, neither the devil or the deep blue sea. "I'm between the ghouls and the monster," he thought. And as he thought it, sharp canine teeth caught the sacking, pulled at it until the fabric tore along the rips Bod had made, and the boy tumbled down on the rocks, where a huge gray animal, like a dog, but far larger, growled and drooled and stood over him. An animal with flaming eyes of white fangs and huge paws. It panted, and it stared at Bod. Ahead of him, the ghouls stopped. "Bloody Nora," said the Duke of Westminster. "That hellhound's got the blinking boy." "Let it have him," said the Emperor of China. "Run!" "Yikes," said the 33rd President of the United States. The ghouls ran up the steps. Bod was now certain that the steps had been carved by giants, for each step was higher than he was. As they fled, the ghouls paused only to turn and make rude gestures at the beast, possibly also at Bod. The beast stayed where it was. "It's going to eat me," Bod thought bitterly. Smart Bod. And he thought of his home in the graveyard, and now he could no longer remember why he had ever left. Monster dog or no monster dog, he had to get back home once more. There were people waiting for him. He pushed past the beast, jumped down to the next step 4 feet below, fell his height, and landed on his ankle, which twisted underneath him painfully, and he dropped heavily onto the rock. He could hear the beast running, jumping down towards him. He tried to wriggle away to pull himself onto his feet, but his ankle was useless, now numb in pain, and before he could stop himself, he fell again. He fell off the step, away from the rock wall, out into space, off the side of the cliff, where he dropped, a nightmarish tumble, down distances that Bod could not even imagine. As he fell, he was certain he heard a voice coming from the general direction of the gray beast, and it was Mrs. Lipskew's voice. "Oh, Bod!" It was like every dream of falling he'd ever had, a scared and frantic drop through space. He headed towards the ground below. Bod felt as though his mind was only big enough for one huge thought. That big dog was actually Mrs. Lipskew, and "I'm going to hit the rock floor and splat," competed in his head for occupation. Something wrapped itself around him, falling at the same speed he was falling, and then there was a loud flapping of leathery wings, and everything slowed. The ground no longer seemed to be heading towards him at the same speed. The wings flapped harder. They lifted slightly, and now the only thought in his head was, "I'm flying." And he was. He turned his head. Above him was a dark brown head, perfectly bald, with deep eyes that looked as if they were polished slabs of black glass. Bod made the screeching sound that means help in Night Gaunt, and the Night Gaunt smiled and made a deep hooting noise in return. It seemed pleased. A swoop and a slow, and they touched down on the desert floor with a thump. Bod tried to stand up, but his ankle betrayed him once again and sent him tumbling down into the sand. The high wind and the sharp desert sand blew hard, stinging Bod's skin. The night god crouched beside him, its leathery wings folded on its back. Bod had grown up in a graveyard and was used to images of winged people, but the angels on the headstones looked nothing like this. And now, bounding towards them across the desert floor, in the shadow of Ghoulheim, a huge gray beast, like an enormous dog. The dog spoke in Mrs. Lipskew's voice. It said, "This is the third time the night gaunts have saved your life, Bod. This was the first. The first was when you called for help and they heard. They got the message to me telling me where you were. The second was around the fire that night when you were asleep. They were circling in the darkness and heard a couple of the ghouls saying that you were ill luck for them and that they should beat your brains with a rock and put you somewhere where they can't find you again. And then when you were they could find you again, and then when you were properly rotted down, they would eat you. The night gods dealt with that matter silently. And now this." "Mrs. Lipskew?" The great dog lowered its head towards him, and for one mad, fear-filled moment he thought she was going to take a bite out of him. But her tongue licked the side of his face affectionately. "You hurt your ankle." "Yes, I can't stand on it." "Let's get you on my back," said the huge gray beast that was Mrs. Lipskew. She said something in a night gaunt's screeching tongue, and it came over to help Bod while he put his arms around Mrs. Lipskew's neck. "Hold my fur," she said. "Hold tight. Now before we go, say," and she made a high screeching noise. "What does it mean?" "Thank you," or "goodbye," or both. Bod screeched as best he could, and the night gaunt made an amused chuckle. Then it made a similar noise, and spread its great leathery wings, and ran into the desert wind, flapping hard. The wind caught it and carried it aloft like a kite that had begun to fly. "Now," said the beast that was Mrs. Lipskew, "hold on tightly." And she began to run. "Are we going to the wall of graves? To the ghoul gates? No, those are for ghouls. I'm a hound of God. I traveled on my own road into hell and out of it." And it seemed to Bod as if she ran even faster then. The huge moon rose, and the smaller mold-colored moon, as they were joined by a ruby-red moon. The gray wolf ran at a steady lope beneath them across the desert of bones. She stopped by a broken clay building like an enormous beehive built beside a small rill of water that came bubbling out of the desert rock, splashed down into a tiny pool, and was gone again. The gray wolf put her head down and drank. Bod scooped the water up with his hands and drank the water in a dozen tiny gulps. "This is the boundary," said the gray wolf that was Mrs. Lipskew, and Bod looked up. The 3 moons had gone. Now he could see the Milky Way, as he'd never seen it before, a glimmering shroud across the arch of the sky. The sky was filled with stars. "They're beautiful," said Bod. "When we get you home," said Mrs. Lipskew, I'll teach you the names of the stars and their constellations." "I'd like that," admitted Bod. Bod clambered onto her huge gray back once more, and he buried his face in her fur and held on tightly, and it seemed only moments later that he was being carried away, awkwardly, as a grown woman carries a 6-year-old boy across a graveyard to the Owens' tomb. "He hurt his ankle," Mrs. Lipskew was saying. "Poor little soul," said Mistress Owens, taking the boy from her and cradling him in her capable, if insubstantial, arms. "I can't say I didn't worry for I did, but he's back now, and that's all that matters." And then he was perfectly comfortable, beneath the earth, in a good place, where his head was on his own pillow, and a gentle, exhausted darkness took him. Bod's ankle was swollen and purple. Dr. Traphus, 1870 to 1936, may he wake to glory, inspected it and pronounced it merely sprained. Miss Lipskew returned from a journey to the chemist's with a tight ankle bandage, and Josiah Worthington Bart, who had been buried with his bony walking cane, insisted on lending it to Bod, who who had too much fun leaning on the stick and pretending to be 100 years old. Bod limped up the hill and retrieved a folded piece of paper from beneath a stone. "The Hounds of God," he read. It was printed in purple ink, and it was the first item on a list. "Those that men call werewolves, or lycanthropes, call themselves hounds of God, as they claim their transformation is a gift from their Creator, and they repay that gift with their tenacity, for they will pursue an evildoer to the very gates of hell." Bod nodded. Not just evildoers, he thought. He read the list, committing it to memory as best he could, and then went down to the chapel where Mrs. Lipscomb was waiting for him with a small meat pie and a huge bag of chips she bought fresh from the fish and chip shop at the bottom of the hill, and another pile of purple inked duplicate lists. The two of them shared the chips, and once or twice Mrs. Lipscomb even smiled. Silas came back at the end of the month. He carried his bag in his left hand, and he held his right arm stiffly. But he was Silas, and Bod was happy to see him, and even happier when Silas gave him a present, a little model of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. It was almost midnight, and it was still not fully dark. The three of them sat atop a hill, with the lights of the city glimmering beneath him. "I trust that all was well in my absence," said Silas. "I learned a lot," said Bod, holding his bridge. He pointed to the night sky. "That's Orion the Hunter up there with his belt of 3 stars, and that's Taurus the Bull." "Very good," said Silas. "And you?" asked Bod. "Did you learn anything while you were away?" "Oh, yes," said Silas, but he declined to elaborate. "I also," said Mrs. Lipscomb primly. "I also learned things." "Good," said Silas. An owl hooted in the branches of an oak tree. "You know, I heard rumors while I was away," said Silas, "that some weeks ago you both went somewhere further afield than I would have been able to follow. Normally, I would advise caution, but unlike some, the ghoul folk have short memories." Bod said, "It's okay. Mrs. Lipscomb looked after me. I was never in any danger." Miss Lipscomb looked at Bod, and her eyes shone, and then she looked at Silas. "There are so many things to know," she said. "Perhaps I come back next year, in high summer also, to teach the boy again." Silas looked at Mrs. Lipscomb, and he raised an eyebrow a fraction, and then he looked at Bod. "I'd like that," said Bod. That is the end of Chapter 3. So I want to thank you for joining me for Chapters 2 and 3 of The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. I will be back tomorrow morning for Chapters 4 and 5. Thanks for joining me. See you tomorrow.